One of the philosophical notes on which I left off was the Kalam Cosmological Argument, more specifically Dr. William Lane Craig's defense of it, and even more specifically the argument's first premise, namely that whatever begins to exist has a cause. That premise, that's what I find the most interesting, because I think that's what philosophy can do the most with without having to defer to science yet. The second premise of the argument, the only other one in the argument, that the universe began to exist, that's a scientific question, the answer to which there is no scientific consensus for, and even among the scientists who would say that that premise is true, there's no consensus about what exactly that means. So I, for one, feel wildly disingenuous pretending I have something interesting to say about that, and in my opinion, so should most philosophers. But I do want to talk about that first premise today, since that is where I left off, and at the risk of repeating things I've said in prior videos, we should probably play catch-up first, starting, like you do, at the beginning. So if you're not familiar, the Kalam argument goes a little something like this. Premise 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, obviously, getting from cause to eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing, personal, moral God is quite a leap and an entire debate unto itself. And we may even breach some stuff relevant to that debate in this video, but my focus here is really going to be on causality, what it is, how it works, and the tremendous qualitative difference between any causal event we've ever actually observed and the kind of causal event that God creating the universe would have to be. Mostly what I want to address about this argument is the cherry picking that needs to take place when it comes to deciding which aspects of causality as we know it should be applied as absolute metaphysical principles and which ones we can conveniently ignore, because the distinction, as I will argue, would seem entirely arbitrary were it not for the fact that we know proponents like Craig are working backwards from their conclusion. Okay, so let me lay some philosophical piping first. If you're not familiar, there's two really important concepts relevant to this discussion. Creatio ex nihilo, which is Latin for creation out of nothing, and creatio ex materia, which is creation out of material. Or to be more general, just creation out of some previously existing stuff. Now, right off the bat, let me make it clear, creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, is pure speculation. This is not something we've ever had experience with or of. Anything you've ever actually seen caused to begin existing in your lifetime has been so caused ex materia, out of previously existing material. So when we say something like, that carpenter caused that table to begin existing, we don't mean that literally. The carpenter can't cause the table to do anything. It doesn't exist yet. You can't cause something that doesn't exist to do anything, let alone start existing. What the carpenter really does is cause stuff that is not the table, nails, wood, lacquer, to become the table. This is how the table really comes into existence. In fact, as far as our experience goes, this is how anything comes into existence. When material, which is not that thing, is caused to come together and form that thing. Okay, two more concepts I want to run by you. I'm going to get through this, I promise. Aristotle had this really helpful way for thinking about causes. He said that there are 4 different aspects to the creation of a thing that we can talk about. It's efficient cause, material cause, formal cause, and final cause. The efficient cause is either the entity or the action which is responsible for bringing the thing into existence. So if we take the example of a marble sculpture, its efficient cause would be either the sculptor or the act of chiseling. Both would work. The material cause is the previously existing stuff that thing is created out of. In the carpenter table example I used earlier, the material cause would be nails, wood, and lacquer. In this example of the marble sculpture, the material cause is marble. And then you've got the formal cause and the final cause, which are basically the form or shape that the thing ends up taking and the purpose for which it was created, respectively. But it's really just those first two, the efficient cause and the material cause, that concern this argument. The sculptor and the marble, the carpenter and the wood, the affector and the affected, the interaction between which is what gives us the effect of a sculpture or a table. And this is the problem I've always had with pretending that the Kalam argument's first premise is somehow empirically supported. It's not. We don't know that anything beginning to exist has a cause. We know that things beginning to exist ex materia have causes. namely they have efficient causes. This tells us absolutely nothing about things beginning to exist ex nihilo, whether such a thing is even possible, and if it is, whether it's possible to have an efficient cause without any material to act upon. A more honest version of this premise would be whatever begins to exist has a material cause and an efficient cause. I mean, that's the best we can do if we don't cherry pick from our experience of the world. The problem is that when you pair this with Kalam's second premise, the universe began to exist, the only valid conclusion that follows is, therefore, the universe had a material and efficient cause. This is what happens when you take a bottom-up approach to causality, when you start with what we directly apprehend about the world around us and build from there, as opposed to a top-down approach when we begin with some metaphysical or theological doctrine and then appeal to the parts of our experience that support this or confirm this and ignore everything that doesn't. Here's an example of William Lane Craig pretending to take a bottom-up approach when in fact he's working from the top down. Quote, "Now there is no doubt that creatio ex nihilo is deeply baffling. I well recall thinking as I began to study the Kalam Cosmological Argument that all of the alternatives with respect to the universe's existence, the infinitude of the past, creatio ex nihilo, spontaneous origination ex nihilo, were so bizarre that the most reasonable option seemed to be that nothing exists. Since our existence is, however, undeniable, we must settle, however uncomfortably, on one of the above three." End quote. Craig goes on to argue that creatio ex nihilo is more plausible than the two alternatives, and in other videos I've done, I make the argument that it's far less plausible. But that's not what we're talking about here. You may have noticed that despite Craig's assertion here, there aren't just three options. There are four, and Craig is very careful not to mention the most plausible one, creatio ex materia, that God created the universe out of something. This is the only option of the bunch that doesn't require us to throw away some feature of causal interaction that in any other context is crucial. So how does Craig get around this? I mean, what's his excuse for not even throwing this into the mix as an option? Well, his best attempt is to argue that, unlike everything else that begins to exist, the universe, having been created out of something, is, quote, incoherent. He says it is, quote, simply overridden by the arguments for the finitude of the past. For if it is impossible that there be an infinite regress of past events, it is impossible that the first cause be a material object, since matter and energy are never quiescent. End quote. What Craig is saying here, basically, is that material causes exist within space and time, and since the beginning of the universe was the beginning of space and time, it's incoherent to claim that the universe had a material cause. Okay, makes sense. Or does it? Because if you think about it, we can say the exact same thing about efficient causes, can't we? Efficient causes exist within space and time, and since the beginning of the universe was the beginning of space and time, it's incoherent to claim that the universe had an efficient cause. I mean, what should follow from Craig's reasoning here is that the universe having any cause, material or efficient, is, quote, overridden by the arguments for the finitude of the past. I mean, after all, this would make sense. Everything we know about cause and effect from looking at the world around us tells us that when new things are caused to exist, it is by the interaction of efficient causes and material causes within time and space. In the observable, testable, knowable world around us, things do not and cannot be caused to begin existing without each of these elements. Now, you would think that Craig would take this opportunity to try and minimize what our empirical experience can actually tell us about general metaphysical truths, but he doesn't do this. It's weird. In fact, Craig doubles down and insists that anybody who isn't willing to apply our empirical knowledge of causality within the physical universe to the whole of reality is, quote, blind to the evidence. Problem is, he doesn't realize that by taking this position, he's diving onto his own sword. Check this out. Quote, "As for the objection that it is unwise to extrapolate general metaphysical truths from everyday experience, it seems to me wholly unobjectionable to say that the causal principle enjoys experiential support. Should we just ignore the uniform data of experience in support of premise one and behave as if it were just as likely as its opposite? Talk about being blind to the evidence." End quote. But I'll bet you Craig would immediately object to the exact same logic if we simply plug in some other empirically supported features of causality that don't jive with Craig's personal theology. Watch me borrow Craig's own words to make an identical argument for the premise that whatever has an efficient cause must also have a material cause. Let's call this the double causal principle. Quote, as for the objection that it is unwise to extrapolate general metaphysical truths from everyday experience, it seems to me wholly unobjectionable to say that the double causal principle enjoys experiential support. Should we just ignore the uniform data of experience in support of the double causal principle and behave as if it were just as likely as its opposite? Talk about being blind to the evidence. End quote. The double standard here couldn't be more obvious. And come on, let's just come out and say it. The real reason Craig is cherry-picking from our empirical experience in order to posit an efficient cause of the universe without a material cause is because his presupposed theology instructs him to. Here it is, right from the horse's mouth. Quote, let me begin by affirming that Christian theology is committed to creatio ex nihilo. That is to say, the doctrine that God created the universe without any material cause. God is the efficient cause which produced the universe, and there was no material cause. He himself created the matter and energy. When we say that the matter and energy were created out of nothing, we mean merely that, although created, they were not created out of anything. End quote. So Craig is not working from the bottom up. All of his reasons here are ad hoc. That is to say, he is not looking to follow rationality wherever it leads. The inferences he makes are designed specifically to funnel toward and conclude with his own personal theology. And if this means ignoring his own epistemic advice, then fine, so be it. But it shouldn't be a surprise to us because this is how the apologetic game is played. Christian first, philosopher second. Of course, this doesn't stop us from pointing out the flaws in these rationalizations anyway, so let's do that. Craig calls it incoherent to say that the universe itself had a material cause because, quote, the universe is here defined as the whole of material reality. The whole of material reality cannot have had a prior material cause because if it did, then it did not really begin to exist, end quote. And before I say anything about this, it should raise an eyebrow that when it becomes convenient for him, Dr. Craig not only acknowledges, but argues from the fact that the universe is qualitatively different from everything else that begins to exist, and that what is true of causation within the universe needn't apply to the universe as a whole. This alone should cast the entire Kalam argument into serious doubt. But he wants to have his metaphysical cake and eat it too. By the way, metaphysical cake? Mwah! Delicious. It's spongy, very, very spongy. In any case, there are two distinct objections contained within this statement, and they sort of get lumped together. The first is that for the physical universe to have been made out of something, that something would need to exist prior to the universe. And the second is that that something would need to be physical. Let's work backwards. First, the phrase material cause does not necessarily mean physical cause. Craig is equivocating here. The material cause of something is just the stuff out of which it was formed, physical or otherwise. There's nothing incoherent about God forming the physical universe from some non-physical substance. Especially if you already have no problem with God causing the universe by willing it to pop into existence out of nothing whatsoever. Furthermore, the physical universe having a physical material cause may not be all that incoherent in the first place, but I will get to that. In the meantime, let's talk about the other objection. Notice Craig's careful use of the word prior. He says the universe could not have had a prior material cause because the beginning of the universe was the beginning of time itself. Okay, but here's the thing. Who says the material cause of the universe had to exist prior to the universe? Why can't the material cause of the universe exist timelessly and enter into time at the moment of creation? After all, this is exactly the claim that Dr. Craig makes about the efficient cause of the universe, God. Quote, the cosmological singularity in which our universe began is, strictly speaking, not a part of space and time, and therefore it is not earlier than the universe. The singularity is causally prior to our universe, but not chronologically prior to the universe. It exists on the boundary of space-time. Analogously, I want to suggest that we think of God's eternity, like the singularity, as the boundary of time. God is causally prior, but not chronologically prior to the universe. His changeless, timeless, eternal state is the boundary of time at which he exists without the universe, and at the moment of creation, God enters into time in virtue of his real relation to the created order and his knowledge of tensed facts, so that God is timeless without creation and temporal subsequent to creation. End quote. Craig never defends the double standards he employs when it comes to deciding which metaphysical rules we are and aren't allowed to derive from our empirical experience. I think he just banks on nobody noticing that his argument for the plausibility of a timeless efficient cause would apply just as well to a timeless material cause, and that his argument for the implausibility of a timeless material cause would apply just as well to a timeless efficient cause. But the problem is not merely that Craig's own logic, if applied consistently, would allow for a material cause of the universe in addition to an efficient cause. The problem is that it allows for a material cause of the universe instead of an efficient cause. Why is that, Scott? Great question, attentive viewer. But I'm feeling lazy, so I'm going to let Craig do the explaining. Quote, the causal premise of the Kalam Cosmological Argument, namely, everything that begins to exist has a cause, leaves it an open question whether that cause is efficient or material, and is therefore a much more modest premise than everything that begins to exist has a material cause, or everything that begins to exist has an efficient cause. End quote. Now, contrary to Dr. Craig's spin here, this deliberate ambiguity is anything but modest. It's a very clever, very calculated strategic move. Why wouldn't Craig simply say that everything which begins to exist has an efficient cause of its existence? I mean, after all, when we say things like such and such was caused to exist, efficient causes are really what we're talking about, because material causes aren't really causes at all. The material cause of X tells us nothing about how X came into being, or why, or by whom. Imagine being in an art museum with Dr. Craig, standing in front of a marble statue and asking, what caused this statue to begin existing? And Craig goes, marble. Would you consider your question sufficiently answered? No, of course not, because the stuff that something happens to be made from is not what we're referring to when we talk about the cause of its existence. The reason Craig's first premise needs to exhibit this kind of elasticity is because, well, basically quantum mechanics. I mean, because on a very, very small scale, we do have real observable examples of things coming into existence uncaused. I mean, they aren't coming into existence uncaused out of nothing. How could they? The universe exists already. There is no nothing. But they do begin existing spontaneously without anything having caused them to do so. And if Kalam's first premise can't be interpreted in a way that allows for this, then it's false. But what we're left with now is a very different picture of this premise than the one we started with when we first heard it, a picture that is no longer so intuitive or straightforward. But I digress. I've already explained why Craig's arguments against the universe having a material cause don't hold water, and now we have Craig allowing for things to begin existing without an efficient cause so long as they have a material cause. But what would it mean for the universe itself to have a material cause without an efficient cause, to have come into being from something but not by something? What would that even look like? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. I mean, you'd have a kind of non-universe stuff existing eternally in a timeless, changeless, non-spatial state, which spontaneously erupts into the temporal, spatial state of stuff we call the universe. What is this stuff, really? How did it get there in the first place? I don't know. What is God, really? How did he get there in the first place? We would have to presume that this stuff, just like God, would just be there eternally. Now, Craig defines universe as the whole of physical reality, so we have to assume that this timeless, changeless, eternal stuff from whence the universe came is non-physical. Otherwise, we aren't talking about the beginning of the universe, but a transition between states of the universe. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. At this point, what reasons are we actually left with for thinking that the whole of physical reality necessarily had a beginning? Craig's arguments for the finitude of the past don't work against a timeless, changeless state of the universe any more than they work against a timeless, changeless state of God. So according to Craig's own metaphysics, it is entirely plausible that the universe, the whole of physical reality, didn't actually begin to exist at the Big Bang. It simply became temporal, maybe even spatial, at the Big Bang. The most apparent objection to this, obviously, would be to say that such a change has no potential to occur unless it was caused to occur. Of course, devoted fans of William Lane Craig already know the problem with this, namely that an atemporal universe becoming temporal is an event occurring, not a thing beginning to exist. And as such, it's not subject to Kalam's first premise. I'll let Dr. Craig explain. Quote, my argument does not commit us to every event having a cause. What I deny is that things, substances endowed with properties can come into existence without a cause of any sort. End quote. Now, when I first read this, I was I gotta admit, I was really floored, because you don't expect somebody who lends so much epistemic weight to our intuitions to make such a counterintuitive claim. I mean, why should we think that things always require causes, but events, those can just happen spontaneously for no reason at all? Now, personally, I don't put much stock into the reliability of my primate brain's intuitions to assess the ultimate nature of reality, but I'll tell you this much. My intuition that events don't begin to occur uncaused is just as strong as my intuition that things don't begin to exist uncaused. So not only does Dr. Craig work backwards from his conclusion by cherry-picking from our experience, he does it by cherry-picking from our intuitions as well, for what it's worth. But in any case, my project here is not to argue with Craig about this. Rather, I am granting all of his rules and applying them consistently. That's important because Craig doesn't do that. And then following them to their logical conclusions. Now, Craig may still object to the idea of a physical universe existing timelessly on the grounds that it would be incoherent since matter and energy is never quiescent. Quiescent means still, dormant, inactive. But this would be just another metaphysical double standard. Conscious minds are never quiescent either, and yet this never stopped Craig from positing just such a thing. Also, this may just be an issue of poor phrasing, but to say that matter and energy are never quiescent means that they aren't quiescent at any point in time. This can be perfectly true and yet perfectly trivial, since it tells us nothing about what matter and energy would look like in the absence of time. You know how one of the problems with lying is that when you tell too many of them, your story starts to get too complicated, and eventually you can't keep track of which lies are which and who you're telling them to, and then because of that, people start coming to conclusions that you didn't mean for them to come to, and then you have to backpedal, and eventually it all ends up just biting you in the ass. Well, there's kind of a parallel to that in philosophy. I mean, when you commit yourself to working backwards from a single conclusion, and your entire reasoning process becomes about protecting that one conclusion from being falsified at all costs, you can start to lose track of what other kinds of conclusions your inferences commit you to or commit you against. And then when you discover that your own rationalizations can be used against you, you have to do damage control by supplementing those rationalizations with certain principles or axioms that also require rationalizations of their own, which can also be used against you. And then at a certain point, you may not even realize that you've been arguing against yourself. What I'm getting at here, what I hope to have shown, is that ultimately all of the apologetic gymnastics that allow Craig to end up with an efficient cause of the universe without a material cause can likewise be employed by anyone to end up with an efficient cause and material cause of the universe, a material cause without an efficient cause, and even a universe that never began to exist in the first place. The last of which, by the way, not only harmonizes with all of Craig's top-down assertions about causality, whether he likes it or not, it's more parsimonious than Craig's conclusion. Occam's razor says, don't multiply entities unnecessarily. Well, what Occam wants, Occam gets. We have a universe whose existence is totally accounted for without having to posit a thinking, feeling, disembodied person with superpowers. Okay, time to wrap this up. I hope it's clear that I'm not giving an endorsement to any of the cosmological possibilities I've been discussing in this video. My criticism of Craig is a kind of reductio ad absurdum, or reduction to absurdity. I am using Craig's own reasoning against him. I am showing that were it not for his inflexible prior commitment to a theological doctrine, he'd never in a million years be taken in by such reckless inferences. Is there any actual evidence for the universe having an efficient cause but not a material cause, or vice versa, or both, or neither? No. The best answer, the most honest answer, is that we don't know. And we can't know yet because we don't have enough to go on. I mean, you've heard the saying that the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, it's queerer than we can suppose. And that's true. We don't know much, but we know that reality does not behave the way that we think it behaves. But if you're going to play that game, if you're going to make up rules about how the world has to work, even in circumstances about which we have zero data, and use those rules to argue that the universe we live in could not possibly exist unless your God caused it to, then you are going to be spending a lot of time running around putting out small fires that you didn't realize you started. And eventually, you're going to get burned. Thanks for listening.